so that's 1,500 and something years in 19 minutes. We'll start relatively slowly, but don't worry, we'll speed up as we go along. We can point very specifically to when books arrive in England as opposed to Roman Britain. Augustine of Canterbury arrived in 597 with manuscripts. We know that he arrived with some books in his baggage and was sent more from Rome around 600. And he sets up, as a matter of course for the Christian Church, a teaching library, teaching people to read Latin, creating books that people need for their services. And in a way we're then launched into the first phase of library history. Monastic libraries. Vast, enduring institutions. Up until the 12th century, monks, the users of these libraries, would copy the books for themselves. There is, however, a myth that all books in the Middle Ages were made by monks, not after the 11th century. Yes, a few might be, but on the whole thereafter, they would go to urban centres like Oxford, even London, if they've heard of the place, and buy their books from there to stock their shelves. Now, what did they use these books for? Well, apart from services in the church, the main reason was Lectio Divina, divine reading. This is not reading as we're used to it, it is more akin to memorising. And you had one book a year, and doesn't sound very much, but some of these books were massive, and you were required to memorise, internalise its content. Now, in a second language, a theological discussion of vast quantity in 1 year. It's quite a tall task, and if you didn't achieve that, you had to prostrate yourself in Lent and probably be given the same book for the next year to read it again. Now, obviously, the implication of this is that however large your community, you need that number of books, possibly 3 times that number, one on, one off, one in the wash, obviously. And Durham, to pick a place at random, was made into a Benedictine community in 1083. 23 monks were brought to Durham, and the founder gave them 23 reading books. So, sort of neatly works. The collection rapidly grew that was in 1083. By 1150 they had 400 books, we've got their catalogue. By the end of the Middle Ages they had a couple of thousand. That sort of picture has been replicated across England throughout the Middle Ages. Now, who could use these books apart from the monks that are members of those communities? Well, ecclesiastical visitors could consult them in situ. They might loan them to other religious houses for copying there. But basically, it's the members of the community. Was this restrictive in some respects? Was there some way of gaining access to that information? Yes. Because in the 14th century, some very enterprising Franciscans from Oxford did the circuit of all the monastic houses of England and drew up a union catalogue. So you could actually go to Oxford and find out what was in almost any monastic library in England. What were the perils of these libraries? Well, some of the books were so heavy you could be crushed by them. And seriously, don't drop them on your feet. And again, in all seriousness, we have a splendid letter from one abbot to another, saying, would you please loan us your copy of the Sermons of St Bernard of Clairvaux, because the greater part of our copy has just been eaten by a bear. So, there you are. I'd love to know more. They don't tell you. Would you like to know? Was some monk out there, a bear came and he defended himself? Or did, you wonder, the monastic library, did suddenly a bear race in, go to the bounded shelf, take it off, chew it up and head out again? Well, from the 12th century the world of books begins to change with the rise of universities. Obviously Paris first, but in England, Oxford. Students need books, and although all books are being made by hand, fairly rapidly an efficient system is developed in order to create books rapidly. It's called the piece system. University stationers had master copies of books in bits. And if your lecturer said, you've got to read the newest and most boring work by Aquinas for next week, how would you get hold of it? You would go into the university stationer, pay some money, and he would give a bit of the book, 10 pages, to a whole series of different scribes. You could have a new handmade copy in less than a week. So there's a sort of myth that hand-copied books was always a slow business, and responding to the new needs, that wasn't the case. So you could get books quite rapidly for your studies. What about library provision? Actually fairly pathetic. Individual halls of residence and colleges might build up collections because as their old members died, they would leave their books to them. So they ended up with duplicate after duplicate. But in terms of university libraries, almost nothing was done for a very long period of time. Within the colleges, the books were generally divided into books for loan and books for reference, and this is when we sort of see the beginning of a very familiar system. Now, what was the standard loan period? I don't know whether anyone here has ever tried to get a book from a library and it's out on loan, and you come back in 2 weeks or get an email saying next week. The standard loan period in a medieval college was 1 year, so, you know, nothing too hasty. And it was even more sinister than that, because every book that was available for loan had to go out on loan. So once a year, every member of that college was obliged to take it in turns to take a book until the entire loan stock was gone. So you didn't want 1,000 books because you'd be staggering away under 20 that you couldn't carry. It's a fascinating idea. You didn't necessarily want the books you had, you know, the first one you chose you might want, but by the time you get to number 20, you know, there it is. So it's like that old joke of how do you move a library? Well, the staff gets all the members of the library to borrow the books at one place and take them back to another. And what about the books that were in the reference system? They were often chained. They weren't the ones that you would need for reference, they were the ones that were left over after people had borrowed as many as they could, or they were ones that donors gave and insisted they be chained. Why did you give books to a university library in the Middle Ages? Not to enrich the life of students, but for the sake of your soul. You gave them so that the grateful readers would pray for you. Now, I don't know whether you've borrowed books from a library and seen it was given by someone or other. Have you prayed for that person recently? Anyway, equally, who was the librarian? It wasn't a functionary called the librarian, it was a chaplain. And as a matter of course, the librarians within colleges, the university librarians at Oxford and Cambridge, they were university chaplains. You would go to the library, there'd be a sign on the door, sorry, I'm praying. It's a university service day. At the end of the Middle Ages, university libraries, as separate from college libraries, began to emerge. But they were small. At the height of its size, the University Library of Medieval Cambridge, I ought to ask you to guess, but I wouldn't be that mean, had 330 books. That was the largest it got. They weren't open very long, because 150 days of the year the librarian was supposed to be praying for the souls of the benefactors, so they were shut. They were only open during daylight hours, so find this time of the year, that's very short in the winter. You couldn't take in wet clothing or penknives. Now, penknives, obviously for security, but if you don't have a penknife, you can't sharpen and use a quill pen. But don't worry, how did this affect your studies? You know, it obviously sounds dire, but don't worry, it didn't affect your studies because undergraduates weren't allowed in anyway. So the people that needed the books just weren't allowed to get them. It was very simple. That was security. You didn't have to worry about them stealing the books if you didn't let them in.